bank got robbed and kept all his jewelry. Alicia Keys tried to talk some sense in him. 30 minutes later...
Diamonds are forever, Kanye West. Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Later in the show, we'll continue to talk about the issue of diamonds. But in this Valentine's Day special, we also want to talk about this holiday of chocolate. Lots of chocolate, milk chocolate, dark chocolate, caramel-filled chocolate, chocolate hearts, chocolate kisses. Valentine's Day chocolate's the currency in which people are supposed to trade their love. Little do they know that chocolate might have been made with slave labor. Over 40% of the world's cocoa, the primary ingredient in chocolate, comes from the West African nation of the Ivory Coast. The State Department estimates over 100,000 children in the Ivory Coast cocoa industry work under the, quote, worst forms of child labor. Some 10,000 children are victims of human trafficking or enslavement. These child workers labor for long, punishing hours using dangerous tools, facing frequent exposure to dangerous pesticides as they travel great distances in the grueling heat. Those who labor as slaves must also suffer frequent beatings and other cruel treatment. While the Ivory Coast supplies more of the world's cocoa beans than anywhere else, Americans, for their part, are some of the world's biggest buyers, spending some $13 billion a year on chocolate. And U.S. chocolate manufacturers continue to purchase and reap profits from child labor. Brian Campbell is an attorney with the International Labor Rights Fund. He joins us from Washington now. We did invite a representative from the Chocolate Manufacturers Association to join us, but they declined our Valentine's Day invitation. Brian Campbell, lay out the chocolate landscape.
Well, in Cote d'Ivoire, as you mentioned before, there's estimated between 100,000 and 200,000 children working in the worst forms of child labor. Of those 100 to 200,000, 15,000 are estimated to be working as forced laborers who have been trafficked into Cote d'Ivoire in order to produce cocoa for export. The cocoa companies, the primary cocoa companies that export from Cote d'Ivoire are Archer Daniels Midland Company, the Cargill Corporation, and Nestle Corporation. These companies continue, despite an ongoing civil war and civil conflict in Cote d'Ivoire, they continue to go up country into the cocoa regions to purchase cocoa from the farmers and to then process the cocoa and export it to the European and American market.
You're suing Cargill?
The International Labor Rights Fund in 2005, when it became apparent that they were going to miss their deadline that they had set for themselves with agreement under the Harkin Protocol, the International Labor Rights Fund filed suit on behalf of 3 children in particular, but also on behalf of a class of children, alleging that the companies have aided and abetted and provided logistical support that has led to the use of trafficked child labor and forced child labor in Cote d'Ivoire. The law that we sue under is the Alien Torts Claim Act, the Torture Victims Protection Act here in the United States, but also we have claims under state law, which is a contract claim that essentially says that the corporate codes of conduct that the companies have integrated into their contracts with their suppliers create a binding responsibility on behalf of the companies to ensure that forced child labor is not used in the production of cocoa.
And just to be clear, the Harkin-Engel protocol, you're talking about Senator Harkin and Congressmember Engel. What do they have to do with this?
In 2000 and 2001, there were a series of reports done by the BBC and Knight Ridder, which really exposed the severity of the problem in West Africa. And so in 2001, Senator Harkin and Representative Engel called together industry representatives, labor unions, and civil society to engage in to agree to a protocol which would set standards and require the companies to monitor and certify that their cocoa is not being made by forced child labor or in the worst forms of child labor by 2005. The protocol was a step that occurred after there was a threat of legislation that was going to require the companies to certify through labeling that imports of cocoa were not produced with forced child labor. The companies, fearing that the label would require them to actually integrate in a much quicker way monitoring and certification program, managed to negotiate an alternate settlement, which ended up being the Harkin protocol.
Describe actually what happens to the children. We have all different kinds of situations. You're talking about slave labor, you're talking about child labor. Tell us particular stories.
Well, of our three plaintiffs in the lawsuit, each one of them was living in Mali, and they had been trafficked into Cote d'Ivoire, and they were searching for a better living. And essentially they wanted they had heard stories about the wealth in Cote d'Ivoire and about the ability for them to earn income to send back to their parents. So after they were trafficked in with promises that they were going to receive payment and that they were going to be able to return home, the middlemen, the traffickers, sold the children to farmers in West Africa. Well, when the children arrived on the farm, they were housed in squalor, in terrible conditions. They were housed in homes, which then they were forced to labor out in the fields every day under threat of punishment. If they attempted to escape, they could cut their feet. They would force them to drink urine or watch as the other children were forced to drink urine. They were beaten savagely, and they were all forced to live in a very small enclosed space with dozens of other children. The children, after they became older, were eventually allowed to go because they were no longer useful as they reached adulthood, and so they were then released, at which point, on many occasions, they would seek out help. There are some organizations that will rescue the children and return them back to their homes, but also provide rehabilitation.
Brian Campbell, can you talk about the chocolate companies themselves? I mean, you've got the famous companies, Hershey's, Godiva, Mars. Talk about these corporations. What responsibility do they have? What is your assessment of them?
Well, these corporations, of course, make huge amounts of profits. As you mentioned, the $13 billion industry of chocolate just in the United States alone. And 40%, slightly over 40% of the chocolate comes from West Africa, as you mentioned, and comes from Cote d'Ivoire. 70% comes from West Africa. Well, the chocolate companies are completely dependent upon purchasing from Cote d'Ivoire, but they had set that up themselves. They had gone in there decades ago to plant the trees and create the process for which the cocoa is now being harvested. These companies, of course, are the sole lifeblood of Cote d'Ivoire and, to a certain extent, Ghana. And so therefore they play a strong, prominent role in public policy and also the economy of these countries. However, they have stated that they are just innocent purchasers, that they have no input into the process of growing cocoa, and that they have no input into the economy itself in Cote d'Ivoire. However, as is apparent from their prominent role, they actually play a very strong role and have a responsibility to ensure that the cocoa that they receive, the cocoa that's being grown for them, is grown under conditions that meet both international law requirements and also that help sustain and help build a thriving